What a sad, lost, lonely sort of day. Just right for this kind of news. Laurel de Sarin, nee Tazu, peered outside from the eastern breakfast room with its magnificent view of Prothero Bay and sipped his juice. The storm clouds rapidly gathering over on the ocean beyond had eclipsed the brief notes of sunrise, turning the morning back into night. As they rolled towards the coast and speckled the horizon with lightning, it promised the sort of day that news of a family death ought to have. His wives, Duchess Trinia de Sarin, head of House de Sarin, and Aurelie, sat nearby, looking at him thoughtfully. All three of them looked tired, given the early hour, though thankfully the nursemaids managed breakfast for the children. At 5 years old, it would be difficult to explain matters to Prendy, and impossible with Setora, who was 2 years younger and ghosting about after her older sister everywhere. "It's already late afternoon in the capital," Trinia remarked, as she looked at him tenderly. She pushed back her plate on the breakfast table, as if it were an important decision, and her voice grew more formal. "It was kind of the staff to wait to notify us directly, considering the importance of the news." "It was, yes. People will expect me to make a statement." Laurel leaned back. Some of the tension in his heart eased under the familial routine of the morning. "It's hard to believe Calandri is gone. I'll call back in a bit and set up a visit with Mother, but I wanted the morning with both of you first." "We appreciate it, dear heart," Aurelia said, her meal largely untouched. While they'd hoped to sleep in, the call roused them out. There was no going back to sleep after news like that. Laurel looked at his wives. Both had dark rings under their eyes from a late night getting the girls to bed, and he was certain his eyes matched theirs. While the nannies handled the girls in the morning, allowing work to be done, as parents they made it a practice to spend the afternoon and evening with the children, telling them stories before bed. Of late, Prendy had taken to embellishing the tales as he read them. Last night, the bedtime story hadn't simply been two little girls, who looked suspiciously like Prendy and Setora, on their walk along the beach to a small house. Instead, Prendy asserted it was a big house, with the iron conviction that only being 5 years old could give. Setora had backed her sister firmly on this point. The story of the walk along the beach to the big house, where the two little girls met their father. It wasn't their father, explained Prendy, but a wicked human wizard, or maybe a Helcom, but definitely not a Rakiri or anything like that, as he locked the little girls in the basement without dinner. Setora, being very fond of stories with wizards and sea spirits and magic, had backed her sister on this as well, though she'd pulled the blankets up higher. So the story of the walk to the big house, where the two little girls met the Helcom wizard, pretending to be their father, who locked them away in the basement without dinner, and the girls planned their escape. No, he was told. Before escaping, the girls were met by the spirits of all the other dead little girls in the basement, who whispered warnings to them, and the babies who floated through the air, and might or might not have been dead, and... Setora, far less sure about any of that, hadn't gone to sleep for over an hour past her sister, who slept like a stone. It really was surprising there wasn't a genre of horror made just for 5-year-olds. "What do you think will happen after the funeral?" Trinia asked quietly, her tender look taking on an aspect of concern. It was the question he'd been dreading. Although raised with court politics, his escape into married life as Trinia's husband had been such a relief. Even so, there remained obligations they all knew would last his entire lifetime. "I suppose I need to talk to Mother about that." Laurel turned away from the window and sat back down in his chair, which was a bit taller, and let him look at his wives much closer to eye level. To think that only yesterday they'd been sitting here bantering about adding another wife to the family. As Empress, she'll officially go into mourning. I should join her and Camordri on the journey to collect Calandri's remains. "It's not like taking a ceremonial canoe to the next island, Laurel," Orlea said, looking over to Trinia for support. What if something happens? I will be quite secure in a battleship surrounded by a fleet. He shook his head gently. Even with palace security aboard, one of us should be with you, Orlea maintained. She's right. This needs the look of the thing, and Orlea can manage the holdings and the children for a few weeks. Trinia nodded, though he couldn't help but notice her hands twisting a napkin. Besides, you shouldn't go alone. I suppose you're right, he sighed, setting down his juice. We can decide after I see what the palace is setting in motion. What about Kera? Orlea asked as she refilled everyone's cups, while Laurel watched. Hopefully the tea would wake all of them up a bit more, but Laurel felt the weight of his sister's death drifting under him, her spirit below in the deep. She isn't an adult yet. He shook his head. Oh, I know she'd be of age to come out under normal circumstances, but the palace has always protected us until we finished our education. It's traditional. Let her enjoy her time at... That isn't what she means, Trinia said gently. She's talking about the succession. We both were while you were in the bathroom. Laurel smiled wanly at that. Plotting behind my back while I'm sleep-deprived? You snore, Orlea sniffed, though she smiled as she said it. Maybe. He looked away, feigning indifference, but he nodded. I must talk to Mother, as the Empress. Camaldry was never a problem, but with Calandry gone... Camaldry is awful, Laurel. His eyes darted to her in shock, but as his first wife and as a duchess, Trinia was more than familiar with his sister. She's completely unfit to be Empress. What are you suggesting? That I spend the voyage trying to earn my mother's favour? He said, feeling a fresh spike of distress in his chest. The Empress will be in mourning, and I'm not going to spend the next few weeks playing games. It's indecent. It may be necessary, Trinia said, with the tone of voice she used as a duchess instead of as his first wife, and he was hurt to see Orlea nod in agreement. For a moment he felt like he was reading what turned into a horror story to Prendy and Satora all over again. He felt the panic flutter inside, but they looked at him resolutely. We're far more worried about Camaldry than any fleet of pirates. There hasn't been an emperor in ages, and look how that went. He shook his head dismissively. It's preposterous. No. Dear heart, we love you. Orlea looked at him and counted her head, as she studied his face. But Trinia is right. Camaldry is a venomous bitch. And while she does her part in public, you know what she's like. Can you imagine what she'd be like for the Empire? Do you think she won't be working against you? I'll take care of myself, but the rest? I'm not having it. No! He spread his small hands and slapped them on the thick hardwood table. It seemed unfair that none of the cutlery rattled. I'll talk to the Empress. Kera is almost an adult, and Mother is in good health. This isn't a decision that needs to be made soon. I suppose you're right, Trinia acquiesced after a thoughtful moment. Let's just get you through the trip and the ceremonies, and we can see where things are once we're all back and in safe harbour. Trinia's right, Orlea said compassionately, and set a hand on top of Trinia's as she reached for his. We're here for you. Tom's mind recoiled as he considered the implications. She just declared that Princess Calandry was her sister, something no Shilvanti would do. It wasn't only that the imperial family was held in high regard. In their hearts and minds, the Empress embodied a sacred trust. Claiming to be Calandry's sister, a lie such as that fell somewhere between treason and blasphemy. He sifted through the possibilities and came up empty. Not that people failed to surprise him, but this was a bit much. So, yeah. Despite the tears, she was looking at him now. In fairness, it was the sort of thing that deserved a response, and he numbly fumbled at the options. How did you even address a princess? So, that would make you... Kera. She brushed away the tears that still quietly flowed, as if dismissing them from her awareness, and looked at him anew. No mere assessment. She was focused on him with every ounce of her being. It was the sort of lean and hungry look where you put your grief in a box and focused on anything else to trap it there, closed up and out of mind while you dealt with the world, and he recognized it for what it was. He'd seen the look in the mirror. Princess Kera. The words felt unwieldy as he looked at the girl he'd come to know. Princess Kera Tazu, she said absently, still searching his face. There's nothing else until I'm out as an adult. Then I'll be given a duchy. That's nice, he offered, nodding slowly. What could you really say to something like that? That's nice? Her eyes widened and the tears started flowing again, but her gaze never wavered. She canted her head in disbelief. How can that be all you have to say? Very nice, he amended. Should he have added Princess or Your Highness? The Academy students were all nobility, except Deshin, and by practice the girls were all referred to as Miss, nothing more. Still, this doesn't seem to be that kind of conversation. Is there a palace that comes with the title? What? Yes, but... She shook her head as if she couldn't accept the question. Truthfully, he couldn't blame her. A Scifi would probably know the right thing to say in the situation. Maybe later, after he processed the implications. For the moment, it was like an item that you put on the mantelpiece, where you could appreciate it from a distance. She was a princess. It was a thing. I'm sorry about your sister, Your Highness. That was the right thing to say, certainly, and he tried to hammer his thoughts back on track. Asking about the palace had been a stupid non sequitur, but in fairness she surprised the hell out of him. What was it about the Scifi that every few years they had to turn the world upside down? At least offering his condolences was good manners. The words only brought fresh tears like hot rain, and she slammed her fist down into the soft earth as she huddled against the tree. Her gaze still hadn't left him. How can you say that? That doesn't change anything. Believe me, I know, he sighed. I'd be plucking a strand of not exactly grass. If I could change the universe, I'd have done it for myself a long time ago. There's nothing harder than facing the world when you're facing it alone. Trust me on that, he replied quietly. You have the rest of your family, your mother, the Empress. Well, that's definitely a thing too. I've been sequestered for most of my life. I was raised by nannies, not a real family like the other girls. She's the Empress. My sister. She choked a bit as her words began to spill out faster. My sister and my brother are older than I am. All I've ever been supposed to do is marry well. That doesn't mean they don't love you, he offered, softly. His knowledge of the royal family was superficial, and he realized that while he'd known Kaleri existed, that was about all. He almost asked about her father before memory stirred and he bit off the words. The Empress made time for me, when she was able. Her words grew bitter, and she picked through them carefully. I love my mother. I've seen how hard it is on her, but I barely know her. My sister and brother never had any time for me, except for Kalandri. Tom tried to shuffle what he knew of the Imperial Court into some sort of mental picture, but nothing much came to mind, and the silence stretched between them. Kera? Should he think about her that way? Frowned. Why? Why don't you hate us? She asked, her eyes pleading. I've been here wanting to hate someone, and all I know is that it was probably pirates. I don't even know that for certain. Why don't you hate us? Hating you won't bring my family back, or fix all the years I lived awake but half asleep. He sighed, not because he hadn't wanted the same thing. It was an answer he never thought he'd have to admit to anyone. I was just wanting to die for a long time. I may have cornered the market on despair, but I knew I never wanted to spend the rest of my life consumed by hatred. I hate the pirates, she said with cold fury, and her hands clenched at her sides. They took my only real family from me, and now I have no idea what's going to happen. The Empire killed my family. I don't hate the Empire. Why not? Kera sputtered. What kind of person are you? You know, for a long time I thought the Empire was going to self-destruct in a century or two. Tom frowned down at the not exactly grass, twirling it between his fingers. Now that I've lived with Shilvanti, not so much. You're a different species, but you're still people. He leaned back against a knot palm tree. I'm no fan of how the Imperium came to my world, and I hate what it cost me. But the galaxy isn't exactly a friendly place. Replacing the Shilvanti with the Consortium or the Alliance or Anarchy? Earth being mauled by dozens of independent worlds? I can imagine a lot of alternatives, and they're all worse. That isn't real. She shook her head. That's not even what I asked you. It's as real as the answer gets. I didn't say that makes it easy. He sat a little straighter and tried to look and sound like a parent. It wasn't easy, sitting under a knot palm tree, but he tried. Hate the pirates for what they took from you. Just don't let your life be defined by your hatred. It's empty, and it's self-destructive. But why did you hate us? My family? She wrapped her hands around her knees again and pulled them close. When she spoke again, her voice was small. Why didn't you hate me? You know, before the landings, some humans hated each other because we had different colors of skin, or a different language, all kinds of excuses. He huffed quietly and shook his head. Funny thing, those sorts of people don't hate each other as much anymore because they can all hate Shilvanti. Which means that the only thing they were doing all along is hating because they want to hate. I can't imagine my life would have been better if I hated you. Do you? No. She squirmed, looking away from him now, and fidgeting as she picked over his answer. Princess, if you don't mind my asking, why are you out here all alone? This is as alone as I can get. She glanced back towards the campus. I have an interior agent and 6 pods of commandos watching me around the clock. Getting away from the campus is the most alone I ever get. Tom looked around then, in spite of himself. Off in the distance, one of the groundskeepers was definitely working her way closer. With 6 teams of trained professionals watching over her all the time, she was probably right about... Why are you out here? Tom blinked and looked back at Kera as she cantered ahead. Pardon? I came out here to get away from everybody, just for a little bit. She cantered ahead slightly more and asked again, Why are you out here, Professor? Oh, I'm supposed to teach an extracurricular, so I decided to offer a chess club. He didn't expect understanding and wasn't disappointed. It's an Earth game. I hike out to the biology building where I teach chess. Or would if anyone came. I saw you here. Well, I wanted to check on you. Thank you, Kera nodded, letting go of her knees, and after a moment she brushed off her slacks. Would you mind if I come along? I don't mind at all, Princess Kera. He offered a smile and felt a whisper of relief when she nodded and got up after him. Captain Biona glanced back as Sergeant Diani shuffled back into the control room, with a dinner for all 3 of them. Looking over to Sergeant Yalla, her eyes flickered up to the board. They're heading towards the biology building, Captain, Yalla said after a moment. All right, Biona nodded, and reached back for the plate as Diani passed it forward. We can work with that. The external camera is still set up there, right? Yes. Yalla passed her hands quickly over the boards, while Diani pulled up the tertiary board in back, getting an update on the campus as a whole. They should be walking into microphone range soon, and the classroom pickups are still just fine. I can switch over to the externals as soon as the objective gets closer. The silence in the control room was replaced by the sound of Diani tearing off the cover on her platter and picking out whatever Pod 6 had decided to make for the day. Biona set her plate aside without opening it and rubbed her eyes absently. It had been a long shift. "At least she's not crying anymore," Sergeant Yalla offered. "I thought he'd cheer her up. He's a pretty nice male, even if he is a bit too old." "Isn't," grunted Diala. Biona rubbed her forehead. "Alright, so this is chess." Professor Warwick set out the board, then bumped out a bag of playing pieces, cast roughly, but painted into a set of purple and set in gold. She picked up a piece, turning it over. It was a stubby gold cylinder with crenellations along the end. Honestly, it didn't matter what the game was. She'd loved her sister, but she'd also known what Kalandi signified as heir to the throne. Now she was gone and there was no heir. Laurel had always been nice but distant. Not what her brothers were supposed to be like. She'd not really known him as a person when he'd married a few years ago. As for Camordri, what was it Countess Samilla had said? She pulled her aside one night, only a few weeks before she left for the academy. "Watch out for that one, and if you ever have a problem, let me know." Lady Samilla and Mother had met years before she was born, and she was like the second mother she'd never had. When Auntie Samilla said something, she'd learned to take it to heart. There were rumours about Camordri, but hearing it from someone trusted by the Empress carried weight. As Professor Warwick finished setting up the pieces, she set the golden piece in the last empty space, on the right. "What is the game about, sir?" "Well?" Warwick looked ready to launch into a speech, but chewed his lip thoughtfully. "Once upon a time, 2 princes went to war, and the surviving prince tried to explain to his mother what happened. Maybe I should skip that part." "No, I know. Well, I know you don't mean anything by it. If that's the story of the game, I'd like to hear it." He still looked uncertain, and she canted ahead. "Please?" "Alright. So 2 princes. Let's call them princesses, because I expect it will sound better. I kind of practiced this when I thought I was going to get students. The ruler of a small empire, it was in India, died. The princesses couldn't be reconciled, and so they went to war." He picked up one of the tallest pieces in the back. "These are called queens, but let's call them princesses. They're the most powerful piece in the game." She nodded. That was sensible, and she noted her own princess, watching his hands as they passed over the pieces. When one of the princesses had to kill the other, her father was inconsolable. So she went to all the wisest people, who told her to explain the situation by representing what happened on the board, sort of a demonstration. That's how chess was invented. "You're joking." The idea seemed ridiculous, and she felt a dull ache well up inside her. "It's true. You have to understand, this was a long time before electronic records in my world. It was all just word of mouth and who said what to who." She frowned at the notion. Sometimes humans seemed new and fresh and exciting, and she loved the professor's music, but every once in a while it popped up how recently they'd had anything, really. "This front row? Let's call them Marines. I'll show you how they all move in a moment. In the back row, let's call these your fortresses. Next in are your death's heads, your priestesses, and this is your princess and your husband. The game is played until you capture the other kingdom's husband." "Not until you kill the other princess?" she asked. "You can make another princess, but think of it as a very small empire." Warwick tapped at the slightly smaller piece in the center. "When the husband is gone, the dynasty is over." "Oh, that makes sense." She looked to the pieces then. Arrayed on each side like armies. Or a feuding court. This is a popular game on Earth? Yes. A game called Go probably comes in second, but this is the most popular in our history, he said, nodding to the board. And they're all this violent? Try as she might, the notion of humans grappling in an imperial court just seemed too familiar, which made it odd. Well, there's Risk, Stratego, Battleship. Maybe not the best picks for non-violence. Warwick seemed to deflate a bit, which made her sorry she'd asked. Clue, maybe not that one either. Clue? What's that one about? She asked, hoping for something to cheer him up. It's, the professor sighed. It's murder. The game is about murder. Oh! Not so good then. It surprised her when he laughed. You know, if I were teaching Night Crew, I'd probably feel this embarrassed over Monopoly, so don't worry about it. Alright, but those other games, they're all about war? Warwick closed his eyes and he leaned back from the board. His face was thoughtful but unhappy, and she felt a pang of regret for causing him distress. You weren't supposed to do that with males, and he'd just been trying to take her mind off her problems. Look, Warwick sighed and pursed her lips, the way he sometimes did when thinking things over. You remember the lessons I taught you a few weeks ago about the American Civil War? She nodded at that. The wars on Earth between its early empires made a fascinating contrast to the consolidation across Shill. It was a horrific war. Over 2% of the country died in it, and the living casualties scarred a generation. I know, I didn't really go into that. Warwick grimaced when he saw her surprise, and his eyes still closed again, as he thought about things only he could see. I came here to tell you about the best of humanity, not to drag out all our sins. I don't want to make us look like monsters. I told you it was about economics and ideology, and yes, I told you it was about slavery. I'm grateful that Shivanti hate the idea of slavery, since that made it easy not to talk about one more evil we'd unleashed on ourselves. He opened his eyes then. The fact is that humans are competitive, and when you push us hard enough, it can be easier than I want to admit for us to use violence. But that war mattered. It became about us standing up for the right thing. The South wanted to be recognized as legitimate, and they used cotton, their major product, to try and induce France and England into doing that. Once they gained recognition, they thought they could negotiate an end to the war. I understand that, Professor. She didn't understand how all this fit together when she'd only asked him about human games, but she followed his reasoning. Dredging the bottom never came up smelling sweet. One of the reasons England never recognized the Confederacy was a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was about the realities of the American South, and it didn't pull any punches. When Empress Victoria read it, she openly wept, he said soberly. We can't change the past, but the right words at the right time can change the future for the better. So that's why you're here? To show you can be competitive but not violent? She said tentatively. While this new look at humanity made her wary, it did make sense. The right words at the right time? Partly. Warwick smiled then, which brought her relief. Professor Pelavon was pretty convincing too. So you're here to be my Uncle Tom? She grinned. Warwick looked at her like she'd struck him, and her heart skipped a beat at the sudden change. I'm going to ignore that, because you don't know what you just said. I even get it. Tom Warwick, Uncle Tom. His eyes grew hooded, and there was a touch of something she'd never heard in his voice before. Anger. Uncle Tom was portrayed as a good man, but he was a slave. I've come a long way to make sure no one ever sees humanity as worthless. That we're more than just disposable soldiers. That we are never, ever seen as slaves. Oh, goddess! She felt the blood drain out of her face, realizing the depth of the insult. The idea of slavery was repulsive to her core, and she just... Warwick held up his hand a moment before his eyes found hers. She still found the whites of his eyes and the blue-grey colour disturbing, like the crest of foam on an angry wave, but the anger seemed to be gone. You didn't mean anything by it, and you didn't know.
But what I said, I'm so sorry.
For Giovanni, family was everything. The Empire was everything. Belonging mattered. The very idea of reducing a Giovanni to the status of property. And Warwick mattered. He'd proven he cared.
I humbly apologize, Professor.
Apology accepted. If my name weren't Tom, I'd be flattered to be your uncle. But it is, so let's forget about it, all right? He looked at her hopefully, and she nodded. It's like I told you. Truth may be beauty, but that's a lot different from truth being easy.
You're telling me?
She looked back down at the chess pieces again, seeing them in a new light.
You really don't hate us?
She said simply. Princess Kera, in the past 2 months, you've never said a single thing that I felt was meant to hurt me. Warwick shook his head. I really do not hate you.
Professor? Could you please still just call me Melondi?
Biona nearly choked to death on her tea. It didn't help that third shift was in the room. Sergeant Kalani and Sergeant Veiko had practically been climbing over Sergeant Yalla as Warwick began explaining the board game. But now... At least Solani was there, and Biona nodded gratefully as the other captain began to pound her on the back. Breathing was a good thing, and she sucked air into her lungs before the coughing fit took over. What? You all didn't know? I mean, I didn't say anything because the briefing just called her a retainer's kid, but I served under the Empress when she was just a captain. Biona turned to look as Diani grinned and gave a nervy chuckle. She even gave me my first chewing out. You take off 20 years, 100 pounds of muscle, and give her white hair, and that's Empress Kamalesh all over again.
Professor?
Kamara called out, as she pushed open the entry door to the physics office. She didn't think it was a problem. Akimei Zarin taught all of their favourite classes, and seldom stood on ceremony. She stepped inside quickly when she felt Kaslin pushing behind her.
Professor Zarin, it's Kaslin. And Kamara, she added,
not wanting to be left out. At least they managed to settle the matter of who carried the hoodie by finding a bag they could carry between them. There wasn't a secretary, since the last one quit last year. All her hair had fallen out after the experiment, and the Academy couldn't find a replacement even though it all grew back. Weird.
Her office door is open.
Kaslin nudged her in the ribs before heading right over.
Lynn, you can't just...
Wasted effort. Kaslin had already stuck her head inside the door to Zarin's personal office and was looking around. Honestly, Father would just die if he'd seen it.
She's not here,
Lynn said, pulling her head out of the office. What should we do?
We could wait,
Kamara said, after checking her on the pad.
According to the poster's schedule, she's supposed to be here.
Sounds good, Kaslin grinned before stepping back inside.
I meant out here.
Kamara rushed to catch up, sticking her head inside to see where her sister had gotten off to. Open door or nod, there were times she was just too impulsive. Musicians.
Hey, Mara, look at this.
Kaslin waved her over to where she stood, her eyes glued to a photograph on the wall. Looking in spite of herself, Kamara stared. A younger Professor Zarin stood with her head resting beside Semi Painter, and another human with her arms wrapped around them. They were all grinning like fiends. It was the Sams, both of them. There was a handwritten note on the picture, and just below it was a small plaque with a translation. Akime, thanks for the visit. Can't wait to do more research again. Lots of love, Sam and Sam. Oh my goodness. Of course they'd know each other, but wow. Lynn was wringing her hands, and Mara had to admit she wanted to. But she had to bat at Lynn as she took out her Omnipad and held it up to take pictures. Stop that! It's amazing, but we have to find Professor Zarin, or at least figure out where to leave it. Leave what? The muffled voice came out of nowhere, and Mara felt her heart flip. Kazan was looking everywhere and clutching at her chest, just before the closet door opened. Leave what? Professor Zarin stepped out of the closet. While she was wearing the long, fireproof trench coat she wore around the labs, and she had a VR headset on her head. Little floating eyeballs hung on wires from the sides and bobbled around the room. Sorry. She leaned over and pulled the headset off, blinking slowly, as her eyes adjusted to the room. I can never see in those things properly unless it's totally dark. So, girls, what brings you here? Kazan was at her side so fast, there might have been a sonic boom. We have something for you, Kamara started. It came to our friend and she let us deliver it, nodded Kazan enthusiastically. Jaxmi Chalksa, supplied Mara. Her uncle works with... Ah, Jimsy! Professor Zarin beamed. Oh, that's wonderful. What did they send me? It's some sort of garment, Kazan smiled. With the Painter Institute logo on it. Kamara nodded cheerfully. Could you tell us... Kazan started, then looked to her sister for support. Please? Kamara nodded, making sure to make it polite. Even though she was dying of curiosity, she had to make sure that manners were observed. How do you know the Sams? They chorused. There was an echoing boom that resonated over the campus, and echoed in the speakers of the VR set. Oh, deeps! That batch of metallic hydrogen was doing so well! Zarin frowned petulantly. Alright, girls, one of you grab the Digifraz and the other give me a hand carrying the MS redundancy pile, and I'll tell you all about it. I'll need your help to scrub the whole area of carbon-60. They'll probably say it's soot. Soot! You try to make a perfectly stable monomolecular superconductor and they'll complain about soot. This is in the middle of nowhere. Desi looked at the biology building resentfully. You walk all the way out here? Twice a week, Belda nodded, as she closed the door behind them. It's not that bad a hike. I'm not complaining about the hike. It was those things planted in the last field, Deshin glared. It tried to grab me. I saw it. You city girls, Belda snorted. I told you, they aren't in season yet, and... Hey, I hear voices. Belda held up her hand, and she followed as Belda set off towards one of the classrooms. Belda tapped on the classroom door as she opened it, while she peered in behind her. Professor? Hey girls, come on in, Warwick called back. Deshin stepped inside as Belda opened the door fully, revealing Professor Warwick at a table with Melondi on the other side. She'd been scowling at the board set between them, but looked up, startled. Deshin noted the look, filing it away as something she'd had to ask about, but her insides were still twisting right now. She just wanted to talk to him alone, as hard as it was to find him, and now there was a whole crowd. You girls must be looking for me, because no one just wanders out here, Warwick offered, and nodded at the chairs beside him. Have a seat and tell me what I can do for you. It's nothing that can't wait, Deshin offered. Belda glanced at her but nodded. Right, we just wanted to talk to you about, just stuff. And things, Deshin nodded. If you're here with Melondi, I can find you another time. What? No. Melondi shook her head. I was just out on a walk and I ran into the professor. Nobody came here to learn chess, that's for sure, Warwick grumped, then studied the board on the table. Whatever it is, my time is yours, girls. Deshin started spilling her denials almost as fast as the other two, and they all stopped to look at each other. Whatever it is, I can talk to you alone or together. Warwick looked at her, then at Belda and Melondi before glancing down at the board to move one of the pieces. Friends are the family you get to make for yourselves. It's your move, Melondi. It's your move, Melondi. Belda stared at the pieces on the board so she could look away from her friends. Here she was, trying to figure out what to do about Liam, about his sister, and her family was light years away. Not that Daddy could help with advice on a human boy, and it was almost their third date. What was she going to do? She needed to talk to the professor. At least a human man might know what Liam was thinking. Did he even know what a third date meant? The way Hope had looked at her, it was pretty certain that she did. And what did she want to do? Boys just weren't let out alone, and if two families agreed for a boy to go out with a girl, that meant there was a commitment to something more between their houses. Nothing solid, but a solid start. What would Liam even want? What could she do on Earth? Would Liam want to go to Willist? What would her family say? What would Hope say? She had to figure out how to ask. Belda looked up at her friends. Whatever it was couldn't be as humiliating as this. They wouldn't understand. Both of them had family right here in Shill, and she had no one. It's your move, Melondi. Deshin looked to Warwick fretfully. He knew about her situation, but he didn't know she was alone. How could she explain with the others here? Expose her secrets like that? Risk them talking? Risk being removed from the academy? She needed to talk with the professor. At least he knew her situation and had helped. Together they could make some kind of plan. She hadn't come this far without one, and she couldn't give up now. She just needed help to figure it out. She just needed to talk to Warwick. She glanced over at Belda and Melondi. They were her friends, but would they be if they knew? Whatever they had to talk about, it wouldn't ruin their lives. Both of them had everything. They had a family, and she had no one. It's your move, Melondi. Kalira really wanted to think of herself as Melondi, and learning the game had helped put her thoughts off, mostly. What was she going to do? The palace staff had warned her never to expose her cover. The interior agents who dropped her off had been firm about it. Never tell. Never use your heart, use your head. Never give anyone leverage. But, she'd told the professor. He'd helped. He was helping. She needed to talk to him more. He didn't act like he had any stake in her as a princess, and he'd listened. And he called her Melondi when she'd asked. It felt like he could be objective. She glanced over at Deshin and Belda. They were her friends, but they had families that loved them. Mother loved her, but she was Empress, and she barely knew her siblings. They were never a real family, not like what her friends had. She looked at the pieces. The game really was like a royal court, and it was kind of fun. Friends are the family you get to make for yourselves. Mother had Lady Samilla, and if half the stories about her were true, she had to decide for herself. It was her life, but all her real life was just obligations, and a problem. They're nobles, but this? They would understand, would they? Desi? Belle? So, can I talk to you and keep this a secret? Sure. Belda looked up from the board. You have my oath on it, Mel. As your advisor, you have my word, Desi said firmly, and the fretful look she'd been wearing turned into a smile. My word on it, by the Empress. About that. Trinia looked over at Aurelea as Laral left to call the palace, and shook her head. So, it's settled then. I'll go with him. I don't care how much security there is. Some days I think our husband would walk out an airlock when he wasn't paying attention. He's not that bad. Aurelea poured herself a final cup of tea, and exchanged looks with Trinia. "All right, sometimes he is, but it's Camordri I'm worried about. Please tell me you'll keep an eye on him." "Both eyes, all the time. The Grinshaw may lie down with the Taurox, but the Taurox won't get much sleep," Trinia said warily. "I expect I won't either." "Something will need to be done." Aurelia blew on her cup to cool it before taking a sip. "Better sooner than later." "I know. But Camordri will be on her best behavior the whole trip. Probably." Trinia leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. "I'll be watching for a chink in her armor, though. We can't allow the Empire to fall into her hands. Can you imagine the kind of world Prendi and Satora would grow up in?" Aurelia nodded and sipped at her tea, letting the warmth seep into her for a moment, as they sat together in companionable silence. Trinia sat at the desk, poking through her omnipad, setting things up for her absence.
"What about Kalira?"
"A girl who hasn't even finished school? Camordri may be a self-absorbed hedonist with delusions of adequacy, but at least she's seen the government, knows how it works." Trinia set down her omnipad and shook her head. "If things start going badly, then we have to take steps. Handing the Empire over to an inexperienced child won't be much of an improvement."
"We can't let Laral find out. He'd be crushed."
Aurelia set down her cup and looked at her co-wife.
"Hopefully things will just stay quiet. Given a few years, we have the time to see how things turn out." "Hopefully. But if things start to get exciting while I'm gone, you may need to take steps. This is about the Empire, but we have to think about family."
Trinia picked up her omnipad again and made a note, before setting it back down with a sigh.
"At least we're setting off with good intentions. That's what matters."